The primary beneficiary is Emily Carter. That was the moment my father stopped breathing, not literally, but the kind of stillness that makes a room feel like the air has been pulled out of it, the kind where even the lawyer pauses for half a second because something invisible just shifted, and I remember thinking, standing in the back of that polished conference room with my hands folded in front of me, that this was exactly how my grandmother must have imagined it would happen, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet collapse of certainty right in front of witnesses who suddenly didn't know where to look. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because if you had walked into that room 10 minutes earlier, you would have believed what my parents believed, that I wasn't supposed to be there, that my name had already been erased from anything that mattered, that whatever my grandmother had left behind belonged to them. To my mother sitting straight-backed in her cream blazer, with her fingers laced tightly together, to my father with his legal pad and his pen already uncapped like he was preparing to sign something inevitable, and to my sister Olivia, who didn't even bother to hide her smile as she scrolled through her phone, occasionally glancing up at the lawyer as if this whole process was just a formality standing between her and the life she had already decided was hers, because that's how it had always been, Olivia in the center, Olivia with the future, Olivia with the plans everyone invested in, and me somewhere at the edge of the frame, present but not necessary, included but not considered. And if you had asked my parents 3 years ago which daughter would one day be sitting at a table like this, they would have said Olivia without hesitation. They would have said it the way my father used to say things at dinner, calmly, confidently, like he was stating a fact instead of making a choice. Your sister has direction, he once told me. Not even looking up from his plate, she knows how to build something that matters. And I remember nodding back then, because arguing never changed anything, it only made the silence afterward heavier, the kind of silence that lingers in a room long after everyone has left. But what they didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that silence has a way of collecting things, details, moments, promises whispered when no one else is listening, and my grandmother had always noticed those things. She noticed who showed up and who didn't, who stayed and who left early, who spoke and who was spoken over, and more importantly, who listened. I didn't realize how much she was paying attention until much later, until the hospital room, until the weeks that blurred together into something measured not in days, but in small routines, the hum of machines, the soft beat that marked time in a way no clock ever could, the way her hand would tighten around mine whenever the nurses adjusted something. And my parents, they visited, of course they did, but not like that, not for hours, not long enough to see the pattern of good days and bad days, not long enough to hear the stories she told when the room was quiet and the lights were low. Stories about how things used to be, about decisions that changed everything, about mistakes that took years to understand, and I didn't know it then. I didn't know why she would look at me the way she did sometimes, like she was measuring something I couldn't see, like she was trying to decide if I understood something she hadn't said out loud yet. But I remember one night in particular, the rain tapping lightly against the window, the kind of steady sound that makes everything else feel distant, and she squeezed my hand a little tighter than usual and said, "Emily, pay attention to who thinks they already own something." And I didn't know what she meant, not really. I thought maybe she was talking about the house, or the accounts, or the things my parents had already started discussing in hushed conversations just outside the door, conversations that stopped the moment I stepped into the hallway. But now, standing in that conference room, watching my father's pen hover just above the paper as the lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked down at the document again, I understood exactly what she meant, because my parents had already decided how this would go. They had already moved through the story in their heads. They had already reached the ending where everything fell neatly into place, where Olivia received what she deserved, where they maintained control, where I remained exactly where I had always been, just outside the circle. And the thing about people who think they already own something is that they stop paying attention, they stop asking questions, they stop imagining that there might be something they don't know. And that's why my father didn't look toward the door when it opened, not at first. He was too focused on the paper in front of him, too certain of the outcome. And my mother didn't turn either. She was watching the lawyer, waiting for the words she expected to hear. And Olivia barely glanced up, just a quick flick of her eyes before she went back to her phone. But the lawyer noticed, his voice catching slightly before he cleared his throat and said, "Before we proceed, we need all named parties present." And that was when my father finally looked up, confusion pulling at the corners of his expression as he followed the lawyer's gaze toward the back of the room, toward me, standing there quietly like I had been the whole time. Like I had been in every room they thought I didn't matter in. And for a second, just a second, no one said anything. And then my father's voice came out sharp, controlled, the way it always did when something unexpected disrupted his plans. she's not supposed to be here, he said, and I could feel every pair of eyes in that room shift, not just toward me, but toward the space between what they thought was happening, and what was actually about to unfold, and I didn't move, I didn't rush forward, I didn't explain, because this wasn't the moment for that. This was the moment my grandmother had prepared, the moment where silence did all the work, where the truth didn't need to be argued or defended, it just needed to be read out loud. And as the lawyer nodded slowly, as he adjusted the document in front of him and said my name again, clearly this time, like it had always belonged there, I saw it happen. I saw the exact second my father realized there was a part of this story he had never been told, and that was the moment everything began to change. My father stared at me like I had just stepped into the wrong room, like I had violated some invisible rule that everyone else understood but me, and for a brief second I almost felt that familiar instinct to apologize, to shrink, to make it easier for everyone by stepping back out and letting things continue the way they were supposed to, but that instinct had been worn down over years of being overlooked, of being told without words exactly where I stood in this family. And something about the way the lawyer kept his eyes on the document, instead of reacting to my father's tone, told me this moment was not about permission anymore, it was about procedure, and procedure does not bend to discomfort. Miss Carter is listed here, the lawyer said evenly, tapping the page with the tip of his pen, and I could hear the faint sound of paper against wood echo slightly in the quiet room, the kind of small sound that suddenly feels louder when no one else is speaking. My mother shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening together just enough for me to notice, and Olivia finally put her phone down, her expression changing from casual disinterest to something sharper, more focused, like she was trying to calculate how this detail fit into the version of reality she had already accepted. There must be a mistake, my father said, and his voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something less certain, something that had not been there a minute ago, and I remembered another time he had used that exact tone, standing in the kitchen 3 years earlier with a stack of documents in his hand, telling me, "You are not part of this process, Emily," as if he was explaining something obvious, something I should have already understood, and I had stood there then the same way I was standing now, quiet, still, absorbing every word without arguing, because arguing had never changed the outcome, it only changed how long the conversation dragged on. And I learned early that silence made people underestimate you, it made them assume there was nothing behind it, no resistance, no plan, just acceptance, and that assumption was something my grandmother never made. She watched everything too closely for that. I remember sitting beside her bed one afternoon when the sunlight was coming through the window at just the right angle, lighting up the edges of the room in that soft gold that makes everything feel slower, and she asked me a question that felt simple at the time. When they speak over you, do you stop thinking? Or do you just stop speaking? And I did not answer right away because I had never separated those two things before, I had always treated them as the same, and she smiled slightly when I hesitated, like she already knew the answer, like she had been waiting for me to realize it on my own, and now, standing in that conference room, I understood why that question mattered, because I had never stopped thinking, not once, even when no one was listening, even when decisions were made without me, even when I was told directly that I did not belong in conversations about the future. I had been paying attention, collecting details the same way she had, noticing patterns, remembering who said what and when, noticing how quickly things shifted depending on who was in the room, and more importantly, noticing what was never said out loud. "We have already reviewed the will," my mother said carefully, her voice softer than my father's but no less firm. There was no mention of Emily, and the lawyer nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like he had expected that statement, like it was part of a sequence he had already prepared for. "You reviewed an earlier draft," he replied, and that was the first time I saw real confusion cross my father's face, not irritation, not dismissal, but confusion, the kind that comes when a piece of information does not fit anywhere in the structure you have built. "Earlier draft," he repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it less real, and Olivia leaned forward slightly, her brows pulling together. "What does that mean?" she asked, and for the first time there was no confidence in her voice, no assumption that she already knew the answer, and the lawyer adjusted the document again, flipping a single page with a deliberate movement that seemed to stretch the moment just a little longer than necessary. "It means," he said, his tone steady, "that your grandmother made revisions after that version was discussed," and I could feel the shift in the room deepen, like something invisible had tilted just enough to make everyone aware that they were no longer standing on stable ground. My father set his pen down slowly, the small click against the table louder than it should have been, and I remembered another small sound, the soft scratch of my grandmother's pen on paper during one of my visits, the way she had paused halfway through writing something and looked up at me with that same measuring expression. Some people, she had said quietly, only understand ownership when it is taken away from them. And at the time I thought she was speaking in general terms, about life, about lessons, about things that take years to unfold. But now, watching my father's hand hover uncertainly over the legal pad, watching my mother's posture lose just a fraction of its certainty, watching Olivia sit completely still for the first time since we entered the room, I realized she had been much more specific than that, and as the lawyer turned the next page and prepared to continue, I knew that whatever came next was not something they had prepared for, not something they could interrupt or redirect, because this was no longer a conversation they controlled. This was something already written, already signed, already waiting to be read out loud, and for the first time in a very long time, I was not the one outside the process, I was the reason it could not continue without me. The lawyer did not rush, and that was the part that made it unbearable for them, because every second stretched just long enough for the doubt to settle deeper, just long enough for the version of reality they had been holding onto to start slipping at the edges, and I could see it in the way my father's shoulders stiffened, in the way my mother's eyes moved back and forth between the document and the lawyer, as if she could catch something before it was said out loud, something she could stop. But there are moments that do not belong to anyone in the room, moments that were decided long before anyone sat down at the table, and this was one of them. This document, the lawyer said, his voice steady and deliberate, was executed 6 months prior to your grandmother's passing, and that detail alone seemed to land heavier than anything else, because 6 months meant recent, 6 months meant intentional, 6 months meant that whatever was written here was not an old idea or a forgotten draft. It was a decision made with full awareness, and I remembered exactly where I had been 6 months before she passed, sitting beside her bed on a quiet afternoon, a legal folder resting on the small table near the window, unopened, untouched by anyone but her, and I had not asked about it, not directly, because I had learned that the most important things were often the ones people chose to reveal on their own terms, and she had always chosen her moments carefully. We need to see that document, my father said, and his tone had shifted again, not sharp this time, not dismissive, but controlled in a different way, like he was trying to regain ground he could feel slipping, and the lawyer nodded slightly. You will, he replied, but I am required to read it in full. And there it was again, that word required, the kind of word that removes negotiation from the room entirely. And Olivia let out a small breath, almost a laugh but not quite, like she was trying to convince herself this was still manageable, still something that could be explained away. This is unnecessary, she said, her voice tighter now. We already know how this is supposed to go. And the lawyer did not respond to her directly, he simply looked back down at the page, and I thought about how many times I had heard that phrase before, how this is supposed to go, as if life followed a script that only certain people were allowed to read, as if outcomes were predetermined based on who you were in the family, not what you did. And my grandmother had never believed in that kind of certainty. She believed in observation, in patterns, in consequences that arrived quietly and then all at once. Clause 3, the lawyer continued, and I felt something shift inside me, not anxiety, not fear, but recognition, like hearing the first note of a song you have been waiting for without realizing it. In the event of misrepresentation or premature assumption of ownership by designated parties, he read, and my father leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening as if the words themselves were unfamiliar, as if they did not belong in a document he thought he understood. The authority granted to those parties shall be considered provisional, and there was a pause, a deliberate one, just long enough for the weight of that sentence to settle, and I saw it happen again, that small but undeniable crack in certainty. Because provisional is not ownership, provisional is temporary, conditional, something that can be taken back. And my mother's hand moved slightly on the table, her fingers no longer laced together but resting apart, like she had forgotten to hold them steady. And I remembered another moment, another pause, my grandmother's voice low as she spoke. People reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one is watching, and she had looked at me then, not with softness, but with something sharper, something that felt like instruction. And I had not fully understood what she meant, not until now, not until I watched my father's expression shift from confusion to something closer to realization, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. What exactly are you implying? He asked. And for the first time there was no control in the question. Just a need for clarity, a need for something solid to hold on to, and the lawyer did not look up when he answered. I am not implying anything, I am reading what is written. And the distinction mattered, because implication can be argued, but written words, signed and witnessed, do not change based on who is listening. and Olivia's posture had changed completely now, her back no longer relaxed, her hands resting flat against the table, as if she needed to anchor herself to something, anything. And I could feel the room narrowing, not physically, but in focus, everything drawing toward the document in the lawyer's hands, everything else fading into the background, including me. And that was the part that almost made me smile, because for once, being overlooked worked in my favor. For once, their attention was exactly where it needed to be, not on me, not on questioning why I was there, but on the words that were about to redefine everything they thought they had secured. And as the lawyer turned the page, his movements precise, unhurried, I knew we were getting closer to the part my grandmother had prepared most carefully, the part she had protected until the exact moment it would matter, and I could almost hear her voice again, steady and certain. Timing, she had said once, is the difference between being ignored and being undeniable. And as the next clause began, I understood that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where nothing needed to be explained, because the truth, once spoken, would leave no space for doubt. Clause 4, the lawyer said, and his voice did not change, but something in the room did, something subtle but undeniable, like the exact moment before a storm breaks when the air feels heavier even though nothing visible has shifted yet. And I watched my father lean back slightly in his chair, not relaxed, not comfortable, but as if he needed distance from the document in front of him, as if space might somehow make the words easier to process, in the event that any acting trustee assumes permanent control prior to the formal reading of this document. The lawyer continued, all such authority shall be immediately revoked upon verification of intent, and the phrase hung there, precise and clinical, but impossible to ignore, and I could see my mother's lips pressed together, her gaze fixed now not on the lawyer, but on the table itself, as if looking down might steady something that was starting to slip. And Olivia shifted again, her chair making the faintest sound against the floor, the kind of sound that feels louder than it is when everyone else is silent. This is getting unnecessarily complicated, she said, but there was no confidence left in her voice, no trace of the casual certainty she had walked in with, and I thought about how quickly things change when certainty is replaced with questions, how fast confidence drains when the outcome is no longer guaranteed, and I remembered a different room, a different table, 3 years earlier, when my father had placed a document in front of me and tapped it once with his pen, the same gesture, the same quiet authority. This is just a formality, he had said, it confirms that Olivia will be managing the estate when the time comes, and I had looked at the paper then, not because I was considering signing it, but because I wanted to understand what was being asked without being explained, and I had noticed the language, the way certain phrases were worded just loosely enough to sound harmless but specific enough to shift control entirely, and when I did not reach for the pen, when I simply sat there and let the silence stretch, my father had exhaled sharply and said, you are making this more difficult than it needs to be, and that was when I realized something important, not about the document, but about them, about how much they relied on assumption, on expectation, on the idea that I would comply simply because that was the role I had always played. And when I did not sign, when I quietly pushed the paper back across the table, my mother had looked at me with something that was almost confusion, like she did not understand how the pattern had broken, and Olivia had laughed softly, dismissively. It does not matter, she had said, it will be handled anyway, and at the time, she was right. Because they did handle it, they moved forward as if my absence from the agreement was just a minor inconvenience, something that would not affect the outcome, and for a while, it did not. They made decisions, they organized accounts, they spoke about the estate as if it was already theirs, as if ownership was something that could be declared instead of granted, and I did what I had always done. I stepped back, I stayed quiet, I watched, and my grandmother noticed. She always noticed, even when no one else did. You did not sign, she said one evening, her voice low but certain, and I remember looking at her, surprised not because she knew, but because she said it out loud, because she chose to acknowledge it when no one else had, and I asked her why it mattered, and she held my gaze for a moment before answering, because it tells me you understand the difference between being included and being used, and at the time, I thought that was all it meant, that my refusal had simply been a small act of awareness, a quiet line I chose not to cross. But now, standing in that conference room, listening as the lawyer's voice continued, I realized it had meant much more than that. It had been a signal, a piece of information my grandmother had taken into account when she made her decisions, and those decisions were now unfolding in real time. Verification of intent, my father repeated, his voice slower now, more measured, like he was trying to unpack the meaning one word at a time, and the lawyer nodded slightly. Yes, he said, intent demonstrated through actions taken prior to this reading, and that was when everything connected, not all at once, but enough for the realization to begin forming, enough for the certainty they had walked in with to dissolve into something else entirely, and I could see it in the way my father's eyes shifted, no longer focused on the document alone, but flicking briefly toward me before returning to the page, as if he was starting to understand that I was not just present in this room, I was part of what was being read, part of what had already been decided, and Olivia's hands were no longer steady on the table, her fingers curling slightly against the surface as if she needed to hold on to something, anything, and my mother finally looked up again, her expression no longer composed, no longer controlled, but searching, like she was trying to find a version of events that still made sense, and as the lawyer prepared to continue, as he turned the page with that same deliberate precision, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not triumph, but clarity, the kind that comes when everything you have observed quietly, patiently, without acknowledgement, finally aligns into something undeniable, and I knew then that whatever came next was not going to be explained away, not going to be dismissed or redirected, because this was no longer about what they believed. This was about what had already been put in place, long before any of us sat down at this table, long before they assumed the outcome was theirs to control. Clause 5, the lawyer said, and this time he did not pause before continuing, as if he understood that hesitation would only give them space to interrupt, to question, to try to regain control of a process that was no longer theirs to manage. Any party found to have acted in presumption of ownership, including but not limited to financial consolidation, asset reallocation, or representation of authority without final designation, shall be subject to immediate forfeiture of all provisional rights, and the words landed differently than the ones before, heavier, sharper, because they were no longer abstract, they were specific, they described actions that had already been taken, actions that could not be undone simply by denying them, and I saw it in the way my father's expression changed, not gradually, but all at once, like something had finally clicked into place, like the structure he had built in his mind had just been replaced with a version he did not recognize, and for the first time since we sat down, he did not look at the lawyer, he looked at me directly, fully, not past me, not around me, but at me, and there was a question in that look, not spoken, but unmistakable, a question he did not yet know how to ask out loud, and I held his gaze without reacting, without offering anything back, because this was not the moment for explanation, this was the moment for realization, and realization is something people have to arrive at on their own, that is not applicable here, my mother said quickly, her voice cutting through the silence with a precision that felt practiced, but there was strain beneath it now, something that had not been there before. We acted in accordance with what we were told, and the lawyer nodded slightly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging the statement before continuing. The document outlines that determination based on evidence of action, not intention alone, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, because intention can be explained, justified, reframed, but action leaves a record, a trail that does not change based on how it is described afterward, and I thought about the past year, about the quiet ways they had moved forward, consolidating accounts, transferring titles, speaking to advisors as if everything had already been finalized, as if the outcome was no longer in question, and I had watched it all happen from a distance, not interfering, not challenging, not even asking, because I had learned something important from my grandmother, that sometimes the most powerful position is not the one that acts first, but the one that allows others to reveal exactly how far they are willing to go when they believe no one is stopping them. We were managing the estate, my father said, and his voice had lost its earlier certainty, replaced now with something more measured, more careful, like he was choosing each word with deliberate caution, as was expected, and the lawyer turned a single page, his expression unchanged. Management under provisional authority is permitted, he said, permanent assumption is not, and there it was, the line drawn clearly, unmistakably. And I could see my mother's posture shift again, her shoulders no longer squared, her hands now resting apart on the table as if she had forgotten to hold them together, and Olivia's composure had cracked completely, her eyes moving quickly between my father and the lawyer, searching for something stable, something she could still rely on, but finding nothing. This is absurd, she said, her voice sharper now, but lacking the control it had carried before. You are saying that everything we have done does not count, and the lawyer finally looked up, meeting her gaze directly. I am saying that what has been done will be evaluated against the terms set by the testator, he replied, and that word, testator, felt deliberate, formal, a reminder that this was not about family perception or internal agreement, this was about the person who had written the document, the person whose decisions could not be overridden simply because they were inconvenient. And I remembered the last time I saw my grandmother fully alert, fully present, the way she had looked at me with that same steady certainty. Do not interrupt people when they are showing you who they are, she had said, and I had not understood then how important that advice would become, how relevant it would feel in a room like this, watching as every assumption, every quiet decision, every action taken without question began to surface, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the simple act of being. Read aloud, and as the lawyer adjusted the document again, preparing to move forward, I could feel the shift complete, not just in the room, but in the balance of everything that had led to this moment, because this was no longer about what they believed they had secured, this was about what they had done while believing it, and the difference between those two things was about to become impossible to ignore, and for the first time, my father did not reach for his pen, he did not prepare to sign anything, he did not attempt to redirect the conversation, he simply sat there, looking at the document as if it had become something entirely different from what he expected, something that was no longer an extension of his control, but a record of decisions that were now being measured against him, and I remained exactly where I was, still, quiet, present, knowing that the next words would not need any help from me, because everything that mattered was already written, already waiting, already unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Clause 6, the lawyer continued, and this time his voice carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. In the event that forfeiture is enacted under the preceding conditions, all rights, titles, and interests shall immediately transfer to the designated primary beneficiary without delay or contest. And there it was. The first sentence that did not just describe consequences, but finalized them, and I could feel the shift land fully. Now, not as a possibility, not as a warning, but as something already decided, something already in motion, and my father's hand moved slightly on the table, not reaching for the pen, not steady, just moving, as if he needed to remind himself that he was still part of the moment, still capable of responding, but there was nothing to respond to yet, not until the next part was spoken. And I remembered the way my grandmother used to pause before saying something important, not for effect, not to create drama, but to make sure the words landed exactly where they needed to, and the lawyer did the same thing now, a brief stillness, just long enough for everyone in the room to understand that whatever came next would not be undone. The designated primary beneficiary, he said, and I saw my mother straighten slightly, as if instinct alone was pulling her back toward the version of events she still wanted to believe in, and Olivia leaned forward again, her expression tightening, her focus narrowing, waiting, needing to hear something that would restore the structure she had walked in with, and my father did not move at all, his eyes fixed on the document, unblinking, as if he could read ahead, as if he could find the answer before it was spoken. But the lawyer did not rush, he did not skip, he read exactly as it was written, "Is Emily Carter," and the words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled into the room with a quiet finality that made everything else feel irrelevant, and for a second, no one reacted, not because they did not understand, but because they did, because the meaning was immediate and complete, because there was no interpretation that could soften it, and I felt my own breath steady, not quick, not sharp, just steady, like something that had been held in place for a long time had finally been released without resistance. And then it happened, not all at once, but in small, unmistakable ways. My mother's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension leaving them not in a dramatic collapse, but in a subtle release that made her posture look unfamiliar. My father blinked once, slowly, like he was recalibrating, like he was trying to place himself back into a situation that no longer fit the version he had prepared for, and Olivia's expression shifted completely, the confidence gone, replaced by something sharper, something closer to disbelief. "That is not possible," she said, and her voice was quieter now, not controlled, not composed, just quiet, like she was speaking more to herself than to anyone else. And the lawyer did not respond to the statement. He simply continued, "Because that is what procedure demands, it moves forward regardless of reaction, regardless of acceptance, all previously assumed authorities are hereby nullified," he read, and that sentence did something the others had not. It did not just shift control, it removed it entirely, it erased the structure they had been operating under, and I saw it in my father's face, the exact moment he understood that there was nothing left to hold on to, no remaining position to defend, no remaining assumption to rely on. And I thought back to the last conversation I had with my grandmother, the way she had looked at me, not with softness, but with certainty. "You do not need to fight for what is already yours," she had said, and I had not known then how literal that statement was, how precisely she had arranged things so that no argument would be necessary, no confrontation required, because everything would be decided by something stronger than opinion, stronger than family dynamics, stronger than expectation. It would be decided by what was written, signed, witnessed, and now, as the lawyer placed the document flat on the table, as the finality of his words settled into the room, I understood exactly what she meant because there was nothing left for me to say, nothing left for me to prove. The outcome did not depend on my voice, it did not depend on whether they accepted it or not, it simply existed, complete and irreversible, and for the first time in my life, I was not waiting to be acknowledged, I was not waiting to be included, I was not standing at the edge of something hoping to be brought in. I was already at the center of it, not because I demanded it, not because I fought for it, but because it had been placed there deliberately, carefully, by someone who had seen everything long before anyone else realized it mattered. And as the silence stretched across the table, heavy but not chaotic, still but not uncertain, I remained exactly where I was, calm, steady, present, knowing that the next move was not mine to make because there was no move left, only acceptance, or the absence of it, and either way, nothing about the outcome would change. No one spoke for what felt like several seconds, but it might have only been 2 or 3, the kind of silence that stretches because no one knows what version of themselves to step into next, and I watched it happen in real time. The way people shift when certainty disappears, the way posture changes when control is no longer an option, and my father was the first to move, not dramatically, not with anger, but with something slower, something heavier. He leaned back slightly and exhaled through his nose, a small controlled breath that sounded like he was trying to steady something internal rather than react outwardly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point since we walked into the room. "This does not change the overall structure," he said, and the words were careful, measured, like he was testing them as he said them, trying to rebuild something from what was left. And I recognized that instinct immediately, the need to reframe, to reposition, to find a version of events that still allowed him to maintain some level of authority. And I had seen it before, many times, usually at the dinner table when conversations shifted in ways he did not expect. He would pause, adjust, and then speak again as if nothing had changed, as if the direction of the conversation had always been his to control. But this time was different. Because this was not a conversation, this was a record, and records do not adjust to tone. The structure, the lawyer repeated calmly, has already been defined within the document, and he did not elaborate, he did not argue, he simply stated it, and that was enough because it left no space for interpretation. And I saw my father's jaw tighten slightly, not in anger but in recognition. The kind that comes when someone realizes the rules they have been operating under no longer apply. And my mother finally turned toward me, fully, not just a glance, not just a passing look, but a direct, sustained gaze, and there was something unfamiliar in it, not softness, not apology, but awareness, as if she was seeing me in a context she had never considered before, and for a moment I almost felt the weight of that, the years of being overlooked condensed into a single point of recognition, but it passed quickly, because recognition without action does not change anything. And Olivia was the next to speak, her voice sharper again, but uneven, like it had not quite found its footing. "So what, you just take everything now," she said, and the phrasing mattered, because it revealed exactly how she understood the situation, not as a transfer of authority that had already been determined, but as something I was doing, something I was choosing. And I shook my head slightly, not in disagreement with her words, but in quiet acknowledgement of the difference between perception and reality. And before I could say anything, the lawyer spoke again. "Miss Carter does not take anything," he said, his tone neutral, precise. "She is assigned what has already been designated," and that distinction landed clearly, because it removed me from the equation of action entirely. I was not the one changing anything, I was the one the document had been written for, and that difference mattered more than anything else in that moment. And Olivia leaned back in her chair, her expression tightening further, as if she was trying to process something that did not align with the expectations she had built over years. And I thought about how expectations form, not in a single moment, but over time, through repetition, through patterns that go unchallenged, through assumptions that are never corrected, and how those expectations can feel like truth until something disrupts them completely. And my grandmother had understood that better than anyone. She had watched those patterns form, she had seen how they shaped behavior, how they influenced decisions, and she had chosen not to interrupt them, not directly, but to let them develop fully, to let them become clear, undeniable. And then she had acted, not loudly, not confrontationally, but precisely, through something that could not be ignored or dismissed. And as I stood there, watching my family adjust to a reality they had not prepared for, I realized that this moment was not just about the transfer of assets, it was about the exposure of those patterns, the quiet confirmation of everything that had been overlooked, everything that had been assumed, everything that had been decided without me. And now, for the first time, those decisions had consequences that could not be redirected or softened. There are procedures that follow, the lawyer continued, his voice bringing the room back to something more structured, more defined. Documentation will be reviewed. Transitions will be formalized, and all parties will be notified accordingly. And his words carried the calm certainty of someone who had seen situations like this before, someone who understood that the emotional reaction was separate from the legal process, and that the process would continue regardless. And my father nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood that there was no immediate response that would change anything. And my mother looked down again, her hands resting still on the table, no longer tense, but not relaxed either, just still. And Olivia said nothing, her gaze fixed somewhere between the document and the surface of the table, as if she was trying to locate a version of this moment that made sense. And I remained where I was, steady, quiet, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because there was no need to move. Everything that needed to happen had already been set in motion, and for the first time, I was not adjusting to their expectations. They were adjusting to a reality that no longer included them at the center, and that shift, quiet as it was, felt more definitive than anything that had come before. The room did not erupt, there was no raised voice, no sudden movement, just a quiet rearranging of everything that had been assumed for years, and that quiet was heavier than anything else because it left no distraction. No escape from what had just been made clear, and I watched as my father straightened slightly in his chair again, not to reclaim authority, but to regain composure, the kind that comes from habit rather than certainty. We will need to review everything in detail, he said, and the words were careful, slower than before, like he was building a new structure one piece at a time, something that could exist within this new reality. And I recognized that shift immediately, the transition from control to negotiation, from assumption to strategy, and it was familiar in a different way, not from past conversations with him, but from watching how people respond when the outcome is no longer theirs to decide. They do not stop, they adjust, they look for angles, for possibilities, for anything that might still be shaped. And the lawyer nodded once. You will have that opportunity, he said, as part of the formal process. And his tone remained unchanged, steady, neutral, as if nothing about this moment was unusual, as if this was simply how things unfolded when documents were read and expectations were corrected. And in a way, it probably was, just not for us, not for this family, where outcomes had always been decided long before they were spoken out loud. And my mother finally spoke again, but her voice was different now, not sharp, not firm, but quieter, more deliberate. Emily, she said, and hearing my name in that tone, directed at me, without dismissal, without instruction, felt unfamiliar in a way that was almost disorienting. We did not know, she added, and I could tell she believed that mattered, that lack of knowledge might soften something, might shift the weight of what had just been established. And I considered her words for a moment, not emotionally, not reactively, just factually, and I realized something simple, something that had been true for a long time. You did not ask, I said, and my voice came out calm, even, without edge or emphasis, just a statement, and it landed in the space between us with a clarity that did not need explanation, because not knowing and not asking are not the same thing. And she did not respond immediately, her gaze lowering slightly as if the distinction had reached her in a way she had not expected. And Olivia let out a short breath. Almost a laugh again, but this time it carried frustration instead of confidence. This is unbelievable, she said, shaking her head once. You just stood back and let all of this happen. And I looked at her then, fully, the same way I had been looked past for years, and I answered her the same way I had learned to exist in those moments, without defensiveness, without justification. I was not the one making decisions, I said. And that was all, because it was enough, because it pointed to exactly what mattered without expanding into argument. And she looked away first, her expression tightening again, not because she disagreed, but because there was nothing in that statement she could challenge without confronting her own role in everything that had led here. And the lawyer shifted slightly in his seat, bringing the focus back to the process. There are additional provisions, he said. And that phrase alone pulled attention back to the document, back to the structure that was still unfolding, because even now, even after everything that had been read, there was more. And I felt a subtle tension return to the room, not the same as before, not based on certainty, but on uncertainty, on the realization that they did not yet know the full extent of what had been decided. And I remembered the way my grandmother used to organize things, not all at once, not in a single reveal, but in layers, each one building on the last, each one dependent on the one before it. And I had seen it in small ways, in conversations, in the way she would ask questions that seemed simple but led somewhere specific. And I realized that this document was no different. It was structured, intentional, designed to unfold in a way that made each part undeniable before moving to the next, and as the lawyer turned another page, his movements consistent, precise, I could feel that design at work, not as something abstract, but as something real, something present in the room with us, guiding the sequence of events without needing to be explained, and my father leaned forward slightly again, not in control, but in focus, as if he understood that whatever came next could not be anticipated, only received, and my mother remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table now, no longer tense, but not relaxed either, just present, and Olivia did not speak again, her attention fixed entirely on the document, on the source of everything that had just shifted, and I remained where I was, steady, aware, not anticipating, not reacting, just observing, the same way I had for years, but this time from a different position, not outside the process, not excluded from the outcome, but at the center of something that no longer required me to prove my place within it, and as the lawyer began to read again, I understood that this was not the end of the shift, it was only the point where it became visible, where everything that had been set in motion quietly, carefully, over time, was now unfolding in a way that could no longer be ignored or reinterpreted, and whatever came next would not change that, it would only define it further. Clause 7, the lawyer said, and there was something different about the way he spoke this time, not louder, not slower, but with a clarity that made it feel like this was the part everything else had been leading toward, the part my grandmother had built carefully, deliberately, knowing exactly how it would land, in addition to the transfer of all primary assets. The beneficiary shall retain sole discretion over the continuation or termination of any prior financial arrangements established by provisional parties, and I saw it happen immediately, not confusion this time, not disbelief, but recognition, sharp and unmistakable, because this clause did not just shift ownership, it shifted consequences, it reached backward into everything that had already been set in motion and placed it under my control, and I thought about the accounts, the transfers, the quiet systems they had put in place assuming permanence, assuming continuity, and I realized all at once that those systems were no longer theirs to maintain, and my father leaned forward again, more quickly this time, his composure still present but thinner now, stretched. What does that include? He asked, and there was no attempt to mask the urgency in the question, no attempt to frame it as neutral, because he understood, at least in part, what was being said, and the lawyer answered without hesitation, all financial distributions, all property management structures, and any recurring obligations tied to the estate, and the list was precise, comprehensive, leaving no room for partial interpretation, and I could see the shift ripple outward, not just in posture, but in awareness, in the way each of them recalculated something internally, something immediate, something practical, and I remembered the spreadsheet I had once seen on my father's desk, the one he had not meant for me to notice, numbers organized into columns, projected returns, adjusted timelines, everything structured around the assumption that control had already been secured, and I had not said anything then, I had not asked. Because I did not need to, because the information itself was enough, and my grandmother had known that too. She had known exactly what they would do once they believed the outcome was theirs, she had anticipated the steps they would take, the decisions they would make, and she had written this clause not as a reaction, but as a response prepared in advance. You are saying she can just undo everything, Olivia said, her voice sharper again, but now edged with something else, something closer to concern than frustration, and the lawyer looked at her briefly before answering. I am saying she has full authority to determine what remains in place, and what does not. And that distinction mattered, because it was not about undoing for the sake of it, it was about control, about decision-making, about the ability to choose what continues and what ends, and I felt the weight of that settle in a way that was different from the earlier moments, not because it was overwhelming but because it was precise, because it was defined, and I thought back to the late nights in my apartment, the ones where I had sat alone going over my own finances, my own plans, building something small but stable without relying on anything that had been promised or assumed, and how different that process had been from what they had done, how intentional it had been, how measured, and I realized that this authority, this control, was not something unfamiliar to me, it was something I had already learned to handle, just on a different scale, and my mother finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before, but steadier than it had been since the reading began. Emily, she said, and there was hesitation this time, not uncertainty, but consideration, like she was choosing her words more carefully than she ever had with me before. We can discuss how to move forward, and I understood what she was doing, the shift from authority to appeal, from decision to negotiation, and I recognized the pattern, the way people adjust when the balance changes, the way they seek connection when control is no longer an option, and I considered her words for a moment, not emotionally, not defensively, just practically, and I answered the same way I had throughout this entire process, calmly. Directly, there is already a process, I said, and I glanced briefly toward the lawyer, not for confirmation, but as acknowledgement of the structure that was in place, the one that did not depend on personal agreement or negotiation, and she nodded slightly, as if she understood that, as if she recognized that this was not something that could be redirected through conversation alone, and my father remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table now, not the document, not me, but the surface itself, as if he was tracing something invisible, something internal, and Olivia leaned back again, her arms crossing lightly, not defensively, but as if she needed to contain the reaction that had nowhere to go, and the lawyer closed the document gently, not with finality, but with completion, the reading itself done, the implications still unfolding. You will each receive formal documentation outlining the next steps, he said, his tone returning to the procedural, the steady rhythm that had carried this entire process forward, and as he spoke, I realized that this moment, this shift, was no longer confined to this room, it would extend outward, into every account, every property, every arrangement that had been built on an assumption that no longer existed, and I stood there still, steady, not needing to move, not needing to assert anything further, because everything that mattered had already been said, and whatever came next would not change that. It would only reveal how each of them chose to respond to a reality they could no longer reshape. The lawyer's words settled into the room like a final note that did not fade, it simply stayed, and for a moment no one moved, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that could be said had already been made irrelevant by what was written, and I watched as my father slowly reached for his pen again, not to sign anything, not to assert control, but almost out of habit, like his body was following a pattern his mind had not yet caught up with, and he turned the pen once between his fingers before setting it back down, a small, quiet motion that said more than any reaction could have, because it was the first time I had ever seen him with nothing to do, no immediate action to take, no direction to give, and I realized that this moment was not just about losing control, it was about losing the illusion that he had always been the one shaping outcomes, and that realization does not come loudly, it comes quietly, in the absence of movement, in the hesitation between decisions that are no longer yours to make. We should proceed with the formal review, he said finally, and his voice was steady again, but different, not authoritative, not leading, just steady, like he was aligning himself with a process he could no longer direct, and the lawyer nodded, gathering the documents with the same calm precision he had maintained from the beginning. My office will coordinate all necessary steps, he said, and there was something reassuring about the way he spoke, not comforting, but certain, like everything that followed would unfold in a structure that did not depend on emotion, did not depend on family dynamics, but on procedure, on clarity, on documentation, and I could see my mother adjusting to that as well, her posture settling into something more composed, not because she had regained control, but because she had accepted that control was no longer part of the equation, and Olivia remained still, her expression no longer reactive, no longer sharp, but distant, like she was processing something internally that had not yet reached the surface, and I recognized that too, the moment when realization turns inward, when the mind starts retracing steps, revisiting assumptions, trying to understand where the shift began, where the outcome diverged from expectation, and I knew that process would take time, not minutes, not hours, but longer, because it required dismantling something that had been built over years, and that kind of reconstruction does not happen quickly, and as I stood there, watching each of them settle into this new reality in their own way, I felt something unexpected, not satisfaction, not relief, but stillness, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to prepare for, because everything has already unfolded, and I thought back to the first time my grandmother had handed me a document, not a legal one, just a simple set of notes she had written out by hand, instructions for something small, something practical, and she had said, clarity is not about saying more, it is about leaving nothing open to interpretation, and I had not understood then how that principle applied beyond the moment, beyond the task she was explaining, but now I saw it clearly. This entire process, this entire outcome, had been built on that idea, nothing left open, nothing left uncertain, everything defined in a way that could not be reshaped by perception or expectation, and as the lawyer stood, signaling the end of the meeting, I realized that this was not the conclusion of anything, it was the beginning of a different phase, one where actions would follow structure, where decisions would be made within a framework that had already been set. And I stepped forward then, not quickly, not assertively, just a simple movement that placed me at the table instead of behind it, and no one reacted, no one questioned it, because there was nothing to question anymore. My presence was no longer unexpected, it was required, and I rested my hand lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingertips, grounding, real. And my father looked up at me again, not with confusion this time, not with dismissal, but with something closer to acknowledgement, and he nodded once, a small, measured gesture that did not attempt to reclaim anything, did not attempt to redefine the moment, just acknowledged it, and my mother followed that with a slight nod of her own, quieter, more restrained but present, and Olivia did not look at me, not yet, her gaze still fixed downward, still processing, still adjusting, and I did not push that. I did not wait for it because this moment was not about recognition from them, it was not about validation or acceptance, it was about something that existed independently of all of that, something that had been decided, documented, and now enacted, and as I turned slightly, preparing to leave the room with the same calm pace I had entered, I understood something fully for the first time, not as an idea, not as a realization forming in pieces, but as a complete truth. I had never needed to fight for a place at this table. I had only needed to stand still long enough for the right moment to arrive, and now that it had, there was nothing left to prove, only a future to step into that no longer depended on anyone else's expectations. The hallway outside the conference room felt different, not quieter, not louder, just wider somehow, like the space had expanded now that there was nothing pressing in on it, and I walked at the same steady pace, not rushing, not slowing down, my hand still relaxed at my side, my breathing even, the kind of calm that does not come from relief but from certainty, and I could hear the door behind me open a few seconds later. The soft click of the handle followed by footsteps, measured, familiar. And I did not need to turn to know it was my father, because he had always been the one to follow when something required resolution, when something could not be left incomplete, and I stopped a few steps down the hallway, not because I was waiting, but because I knew he would speak, and he did. "Emily," he said, and there was no sharpness in it, no command, just my name, spoken in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like he was testing how it sounded without expectation attached to it, and I turned then, not abruptly, just enough to face him, and for a moment we stood there, the distance between us not large, but not insignificant either, the kind of distance that carries more history than it appears to hold, and he looked at me the way he had in the room, not past me, not through me, but at me, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, something that was not control, not certainty, but awareness, the kind that comes when a narrative shifts and you are forced to see the parts you had previously ignored. "You could have said something," he said, and the words were not accusatory, not defensive, just stated, like a fact he had arrived at too late, and I considered that for a moment, not because I needed to think of an answer, but because I wanted to choose one that was as clear as everything else that had just unfolded. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked, and my voice remained even, not challenging, not emotional, just direct, and he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, not away, but inward, like he was following the question back through time, through conversations, through decisions, and I could see it in the way his shoulders settled, the way his posture adjusted just slightly, as if the weight of that realization had found its place, and he exhaled quietly. "No," he said, and it was the simplest answer he had given all day, and the most honest, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because that was the point, not what could have been said, but what would not have been heard, and my mother stepped into the hallway then, her movement slower, more deliberate, and she paused a short distance behind him, not interrupting, not stepping forward immediately, just present, and I noticed the way she held her hands. Now, not tightly together, not rigid, but loosely at her sides, like she had let go of something she had been holding without realizing it. "We did what we thought was right," she said, and her voice carried a different kind of weight, not certainty, not defense, but explanation, and I listened, not because I needed the explanation, but because it mattered to her to say it, and I understood that, even if it did not change anything. "For Olivia, for the family," she added, and there it was again. The structure they had always operated within, the justification that made everything make sense from their perspective, and I did not argue with it. I did not challenge it, because it was not incorrect in their view, it was just incomplete, and I answered her the same way I had answered everything else, with clarity. "You decided what that meant without me," I said, and the words were not harsh, not pointed, just precise, and she lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, not in shame, but in recognition, the same quiet understanding that had begun forming in the room, and Olivia appeared a moment later, stopping just inside the doorway, not fully stepping into the hallway, not fully retreating, just standing there, her presence uncertain, and she looked at me, finally, directly, and there was no sharpness in her expression. Now, no dismissal, just something unsettled, something that had not yet found its place. "So what happens now?" she asked, and the question was different from the ones before, not challenging, not defensive, just uncertain, and I thought about that, not in terms of the legal process, not in terms of documents and procedures, but in terms of everything that extended beyond that, everything that could not be written into a clause or defined by a structure, and I realized something simple. Something that felt obvious now that everything else had been made clear. "Now," I said, "everything follows what has already been set," and I did not elaborate, because I did not need to, because the meaning was already present in everything that had just happened, and they all understood that, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that the direction had changed, enough to know that the outcome was no longer something they could shape. And we stood there for another moment, not speaking, not moving, just existing in the space between what had been, and what would be, and then I turned again, continuing down the hallway, my steps steady, unchanged, and this time no one followed immediately, no one called my name again, because there was nothing left to call me back for, nothing left unresolved in the way it had been before, and as I reached the end of the corridor and stepped toward the exit, I felt the same stillness I had felt in the room, not emptiness, not distance, but clarity, the kind that does not ask for confirmation, the kind that does not depend on anyone else to exist, and I understood then that this was not about winning, not about proving anything. It was about something much simpler, something my grandmother had known all along, that value does not come from being chosen by others, it comes from being recognized at the right moment, and once it is, everything else adjusts around it, whether people are ready for it or not. The air outside felt cooler than I expected, not cold, just clear, like stepping into something that did not carry the weight of what had just happened, and I paused for a moment near the glass doors, not because I needed time, but because I noticed something small, the reflection in the glass, the way I stood there. Without hesitation, without that familiar instinct to shrink or second guess, and it struck me that this was new, not the situation, not the outcome, but the absence of that internal adjustment I had made for years without realizing it, and I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the late afternoon light stretching across the pavement in long, quiet lines, and for a moment everything felt still, not empty, not distant, just still, like the world had not changed at all, even though something fundamental had shifted underneath it, and I started walking toward the parking lot, my steps steady, my mind not racing, not replaying the room, or the words or the looks on their faces, just moving forward, and that in itself felt unfamiliar because for so long every interaction with them had lingered, had required processing, analysis, adjustment, but this did not, this felt complete. And I realized that was because nothing had been left unresolved, nothing had been implied or left open to interpretation, everything had been stated clearly, precisely, in a way that did not depend on emotion or reaction, and that clarity removed the need to revisit it, to question it, to wonder if something had been missed, and I reached my car and paused again, my hand resting lightly on the door handle, and I thought about my grandmother, not in fragments, not in scattered memories, but in a single, steady presence, the way she had always been, consistent, deliberate, observant, and I remembered something she said once, not in the hospital, not near the end, but years before, during an ordinary afternoon that did not seem important at the time. "People confuse access with value," she had said, and I had not fully understood it then, but I understood it now completely because I had spent years having access to them, to their decisions, their conversations, their expectations, without ever being assigned value within that structure, and they had mistaken that access for permanence, for control, for ownership, and now that distinction had been made clear, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something that could not be redefined or dismissed, and I opened the car door and sat down, closing it gently behind me, the quiet sound settling around me like a boundary between what had been and what was next, and I placed my hands on the steering wheel, not gripping it, just resting them there, grounding, steady, and I let my eyes close for a moment, not out of exhaustion, not out of overwhelm, but simply to hold on to the clarity of the moment before anything else moved forward, and I thought about what came next, not in terms of the legal process, not in terms of documents or transitions, but in terms of direction, because for the first time, direction was not something I was adapting to, it was something I would define, and that realization did not feel heavy, it did not feel overwhelming, it felt natural, like something I had been preparing for without naming it, through years of observing, of learning, of building quietly in ways that did not depend on recognition, and I opened my eyes again, looking out through the windshield at the open space ahead, and I realized something else, something that felt just as important. I did not need to change who I was to step into this. I did not need to become louder, sharper, More assertive because the strength that brought me here had never been about force, it had been about consistency, about clarity, about knowing when to move and when to remain still, and that would not change now, not because it could not, but because it did not need to, and I started the engine, the quiet hum filling the space around me, steady, controlled, and I pulled out of the parking lot, merging into the road with the same calm precision I had carried through the entire day, and as I drove, I did not look back, not at the building, not at the moment I had just left, because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. Everything that mattered had already been carried forward, already been secured, already been defined, and as the road stretched out ahead, clear and open, I understood that this was not an ending, not even close. It was simply the point where everything that had been set in motion quietly, carefully, without recognition, finally aligned into something visible, something undeniable, and from here, everything else would follow, not by chance, not by reaction, but by design, the same way it always had, just now, for the first time, fully in my hands. The road stretched ahead in a straight, quiet line, and I kept my hands steady on the wheel, not gripping, not tense, just present, the way everything felt now, and as the city slowly shifted around me, buildings giving way to open space, traffic thinning into long stretches of uninterrupted motion, I realized something I had not allowed myself to think about before, not fully, not clearly, and it was not about the money, not about the properties, not even about the control that had just been placed in my hands. It was about the absence of weight, the absence of that constant, quiet pressure to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be included in something that had never truly been mine, and now that pressure was gone, not because it had been resolved, but because it no longer mattered, and that distinction changed everything. And I thought about the years before this, the dinners, the conversations, the moments where I had sat just slightly outside the center of things, listening, observing, adjusting, always aware of the space I occupied and the space I did not, and I realized that I had learned something in those moments, something that had shaped me in ways I did not recognize until now. I had learned how to build without recognition, how to move without announcement, how to hold my place without needing it to be confirmed by anyone else, and that was the part my grandmother had seen, the part she had trusted, not because I demanded anything, but because I understood how to carry something without making it about myself. And as I continued driving, I did not feel the need to call anyone, not a friend, not an advisor, not even to confirm what had just happened, because confirmation was not necessary. Everything had already been made clear in a way that did not require repetition, and I reached a stoplight and slowed the car, the red glow reflecting softly across the windshield, and I rested there for a moment, watching the cross-traffic move steadily from left to right, each car following its own path, its own direction, unaffected by anything outside of it. And I realized that was exactly what this moment was, not a collision, not a disruption, but a change in direction, one that did not need to be explained to anyone else to be real. And when the light turned green, I moved forward again, smooth, uninterrupted. And I knew that everything from this point on would follow that same pattern, steady, intentional, not rushed, not reactive, but aligned with something that had already been set in motion long before this day. And I thought of my grandmother one last time, not as she was in the hospital, not as a memory tied to a moment, but as a presence that had extended into this outcome, into this path, into everything that now existed, because she had seen clearly when others had not, and I understood that what she had given me was not just ownership, not just authority, but clarity, the kind that does not change under pressure, the kind that does not depend on approval. And as the road opened wider ahead of me, I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not relief, not release, just acknowledgement, and I kept driving, not looking back, not needing to, because everything that had mattered behind me had already fulfilled its purpose, and everything ahead of me no longer required permission. And if there is something this story leaves behind, something that lingers beyond the moment itself, it is this: that love without fairness creates distance, that silence does not mean absence of strength, and that the people who are overlooked are often the ones who understand the deepest truths about how to build, how to endure, and how to rise without needing to tear anything down. And sometimes the greatest form of justice is not loud, not confrontational, but quiet and undeniable, a shift that reveals itself not through conflict but through clarity, and in that clarity there is a chance, a real one, for people to see each other differently, to choose fairness over convenience, to listen before deciding, to include before assuming, because in the end, what we give to each other is not just support or recognition, it is the space to exist fully without having to prove it. And when that space is given, truly given, it changes everything, not just for one person but for every relationship it touches.